Thanks for having me again, guys. I really appreciate it. I love your show, and good on you for continuing to do it. Your episode what now?
54.
4.
Yeah.
Good job. I hope you don't stop. Yeah. So I was working in advert gaming, like doing flash games and stuff for BBC and weird things like that. And I was always a VR enthusiast and kind of a basement VR hacker guy. I made like collimated displays and all kinds of weird stuff. And through that, I met Palmer Luckey on a BBS board. And now I'm drawing a blank on what it's called.
Is it like the mod forums?
Meant to be seen.
Yeah.
Yes, it was an old kind of VR garage hacker forum, and Palmer at that point was just pulling together different bits and pieces of hardware. Everybody was experimenting with different, like taking bits of this and that and slamming them together to try to find this kind of right balance of a good VR headset. But he came up with this, kind of brilliant thing where he was taking cell phone parts and accelerometers and leap optics for very wide field of view in a single display. And he had put them together in such a way that it was clear like this was an important kind of step in VR's evolution. And he was going to send a bunch of us, I think there was like 160 of us, just pieces of a kit to put together ourselves. And that's about the time when he had shown Carmack the first really rough prototype of that. And Carmack got super excited, and then of course introduced him to a bunch of industry players, and everything started to snowball really, really fast. And so at that time, the Kickstarter kind of started to come up, and I did the first Oculus logo and a bunch of weird stuff swirling around that. And I was obviously dissatisfied with where I was working. It wasn't my dream job by any means. And I just decided to take the money from one of my prior businesses and put it into doing a VR game like an idiot, because there was no promise of a market. There was no like this was a kickstarted headset that back then, who knows, could have sold 3,000 units or something. But I'm like, screw it, we'll make something. And I brought in a couple close friends that had worked with me prior, and we just started building the first episode of the gallery, which at that time was just called The Gallery. There was no trilogy or anything at that point, and it was quite a different game at that point. But it was always this idea of like mixing like Goonies and Indiana Jones and making you like this central character in a action fantasy movie kind of thing. And what could we do to enable that? And there was no hand tracking. There was no sixed off. Like you couldn't pitch your head forward. There was nothing. So we started looking. We're like, well, of course there's going to be hand tracking. Of course there will be, but there was no guarantee of hand tracking. In fact, every single stage, like for those first 3 years started 2013, I guess, moving forward, we just kept being told, well, we're thinking about it, but like it's a complicated problem. We're probably just going to do a gamepad. And so the company Sixth Sense, we reached out to them. We got the Razer Hydra, and we actually had our earlier version of that as well, like a super early prototype that they had. And what it allowed us to do was stick a tracker on the head so we could simulate sixed off and hand tracking. And so we were building this thing that we had no guarantees would ever come to market, because those things just didn't exist yet, really. But we knew, I guess, intuitively that for VR to feel good, you need to use your hands to interact with, right? Yeah. And so we just kept plodding along, and there were so many heartbreaks talking to Palmer over the years and Oculus about, because they were like stoically on, no, VR is a seated experience, and no, it's just using a gamepad, and no. And so many times we had to kind of shift course and go, okay, well, if this is gamepad, we even built a gamepad version of the game at one point. And it felt terrible. But anyways, we kept evolving the game and what it was as the hardware kept growing. So every 6 months there was a new iteration of hardware with some kind of new major feature, sixed off, blah blah blah. And so
that must have been a nightmare.
It was. So that production was super exciting and the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because and it took a toll on all of us, because there was no rule book for anything. There was no easy Google search for, well, how do you handle, so when it was seated 180, how do you handle rotation, like when you're using a stick-based locomotion system? So we had to build call it comfort mode, VR comfort mode, which is snap turns, in VR. And we were just thinking about, how does a ballerina spin? And they're always setting their position by looking at one fixed point. How do we emulate that in software? And then once that evolved, and then suddenly you could stand up and get full 6-off tracking, it was like, okay, now we kind of have a room scale space. What do we do with that? And then we made something called Blink and Locomotion, which accounted for an elastic play space. Like, it might be just the spot in front of your desk, or it might be a garage size. It could be anything. And we're like, oh shit, how do you account for somebody walking past their boundaries? Like, what visual tools are we giving users so that we're resetting them in the environment? A whole bunch of really hard problems with really exciting journeys to get to answers, but it was always on this 6-month cycle of new hardware. And then as the industry grew, then Valve came in and they're like, we want to bring you to Bellevue and show you something. And so we were in this tiny meeting with Alex from Alchemy, and there were a few kind of the guys from Tiltbrush, and there were a bunch of people in that room that were doing these weird things in VR. And then they introduced HTC. They're like, oh, we're working with HTC and we're going to build this new headset, and it's full room scale and it uses lasers to track you in an environment. And we're going to do hand tracking, right? And this was at the time when Oculus was still on the, no, it's seated 180, it's gamepad. Yep. And so we're like, well, of course we have to start putting some time into developing stuff with Valve. And so that's where we really pushed hard on room scale and hand tracking, because there was obviously a path to market there that made sense. And then Oculus sort of eventually shifted more into that mode as well, where they were actively encouraging room scale and standing and hand control and all of that good stuff. Anyways, very long story short, it was just like this constant cycle of not knowing what hardware would actually be there by the time we launched our first product, and always having to invent to make everything work. So the game was remade probably 6 times.
Wow.
Which was
really stressful.
But the great thing about that was, though, that you had those, because I still remember that very vividly. You had those dev diaries that you did both on your Kickstarter and several other, like YouTube and stuff like that. And I remember I literally lived for those, because I still remember with the Sixth Sense, I believe it was called the STEM system that they were developing then. The STEM system, and you were showing how you were climbing a ladder, and it was at that point that I personally decided I'm gonna start a YouTube channel doing this kind of stuff.
Oh, and awesome.
It's really the kind of stuff that you showed, because people are saying in the chat as well, like, for example, Alexander Meja says that he's being very modest, but Cloudhead Games solved Locomotion VR and they are not credited for doing so. And I do share that opinion. I think many of us do, that the kind of stuff that you showed back then in such an early stage showed the direction where this technology could go, and you were really pushing the forefront of that. And I think we all really admire that.
And also, along with the Locomotion, you also had the inventory system. You also had this backpack system. If you've never played the gallery, basically you've got this backpack that you could pull off your shoulder, and you can manage your inventory that way. And if you play like The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners now, it's basically the same. It's basically that design.
Even when we played the Devouring, I was constantly saying, "Where's my backpack? I want my backpack." And then I think about the gallery, but also the way, that's what I remember, is that when you grabbed an item from the table, it just flipped in a way where it was super realistic, and that's what you now see with
the fireworks scene on the beach.
Oh,
that was just amazing.
Yeah. But
sleeping in the tent to get that one achievement.
And sleeping in the tent. So I've got a question, how because obviously it was very early days then, how did you end up going from, okay, we're an indie studio, we're going to make a game that's VR. How did that then transform into a relationship with Valve, where you're being invited to these really niche, small little events with other sort of developers that are creating stuff around that sort of time as well?
Yeah, Chet Falasek. Well, first of all, I want to say something about Sixth Sense. Amir, who, the CEO of Sixth Sense, I have to shout out to him because a lot of people give him shit for a bunch of things, for being boisterous and whatever. But that man was always the most gentle, giving, supportive guy in VR, like hands down. And he helped us on our way to many conventions early on, and he would give us booth space for free and made a lot of really important introductions for us. And Sixth Sense provided the original technology for hand tracking that I actually honestly thought would carry over into other partnerships. Like I thought it would have been a part of Oculus or maybe even Valve. They all came up with their own solutions. But just shout out to Sixth Sense and Amir because they did a lot for Cloudhead early on. Anyways, Chet Falasek, who was at Valve at the time and kind of like VR's cheerleader there, he was at a convention and I was showing off one of the first earlier versions of the gallery with Sixth Sense hand tracking, and it was seeded at that time, I think. But so you had kind of 3'd off in hands, so there was snap turns and all that kind of stuff happening. And Chet came, and I didn't actually know who Chet was at the time, but he came and tried the demo and he played it, and he was kind of silent through the whole thing and doing his thing. And then afterwards he said, "That's the first VR experience I've played where I haven't felt sick." And he was super impressed with that part of it, that aspect of it. And also because he was interacting with objects, and he's like, "We should talk." And that's kind of how it started. And so Valve was kind of like looking for developers that were pushing the edges that way so that they could eventually show the first sort of demo and prototype of the Vive at that time. So we ended up building like a room scale demo for the Vive it was actually a really cool demo, set in the earlier world of the gallery on this weird elevator, and there was this giant rock monster. There's a video of it out there.
I've been running it.
Yeah. And it was a really, really fun experience to do that, but the timeline was ridiculous. And at that time we were using the prototype Vive. I don't know if you guys have probably seen.
Oh,
this is cool.
Yeah, this is awesome.
This is going to be awesome. Oh wow, look at that.
Holy shit!
That is like a proper relic. That is.
Yeah, I got to put this in glass.
For our audio listeners, you've got the front of a Vive looks like it melted down another half. I've never seen this
it's like
version.
They have a nose module.
Yeah.
Wow, that is awesome.
What's at the back? There's like a plate at the back as well.
So it's because it's two cell phones hung vertically.
Right.
And they didn't even cut the screen. There was no time. It was like, get this done fast. I don't know if I have controllers. I do somewhere. Hang on.
Are they like the sombrero ones?
Yeah, I've got some really early ones.
So this means that you have seen that special room with all those, little
fiducial markers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then we went through a few versions of these, and what was hilarious about them was, so we were scrambling to build this demo for the first room scale demo, and they kept breaking, like the cords kept breaking, so we would get something working so we could test it for like 10 minutes, and then the controllers would break, and then we'd have to like duct tape it or solder it, and then they would break again, and then we're like, okay, it's working, everybody run in and test the thing. It was crazy.
This is amazing.
But yeah, I'm losing my train of thought. A lot of things happened during that time.
Chet was the one that introduced you to Valve, and then so you've been working on this like experimental hardware leading up until obviously the Vive. So then what happens? Like you've got the game established, the Vive releases. You then release the gallery. Like, what was the the community reaction around the game, and how did it perform in terms of sales? Was it something you anticipated, or was it more, or was it less? How did that work out?
It did really well in the beginning of the market because the market was very small, and it was actually bundled. The Call of the Starseed was bundled with the Vive. It was the second bundle that they had done. The first one was Job Sim, and there were a few other titles in there. So it performed very well. It was on a lot of people's computers. So it's interesting, like we did the blink system teleport and like accounted for room scale and boundaries. And the craziest part of that is like we were developing a way to show a user a physical boundary when they approach the edge of their play space. at the same time that Valve was. And so we were like completely overlapping each other because we both knew it needed to be there, but neither of us had it done, but we knew it had to be done by the time the thing launched. So we both had different competing systems. It was such a weird time. But the reason I'm saying that is like kind of the reception to the Call of the Starseed was, you know, really excellent. And it was kind of the first time people saw, you know, how you could engage with the medium in a really immersive way. But it also became kind of a contentious thing because that's when you started hearing people go, well, why do I have to like teleport in the environment? And the specific reason we did teleportation as the first safe thing to do was because, you know, 90% of users their first time in VR would get sick on stick move. And we even had an early portalization version for stick move that would bring in the FOV based on acceleration. But we decided to go whole hog on teleportation as the first thing to do and didn't actually put that in the first game. But again, contentious issue, still a contentious issue. I don't want to do teleportation. I want stick move. But the thing about it is, and it's a really weird psychological thing, is that stick move takes you out of the experience to a degree. There is a loss. Both of them do, but in very different ways. Teleportation takes you out because it's an unnatural way of going from A to B. Stick move takes you out of the experience because you feel like you're in a wheelchair floating through a space, and it's not realistic at all. Teleportation, on the other hand, if you're using a room scale volume, it forces you to be physical in your space. It forces you to physically move around and engage with that area of environment, and you feel very grounded, like you feel like you're in it. Whereas when you're floating around with a stick, you're kind of ghostly. Like the immersion, the sense of immersion and deep presence isn't quite there. So anyways, we've always had that battle, and in subsequent games, when we did Heart of the Emberstone, the second episode, we included a stick move mode, and it wasn't as sticky, like it wasn't as present. And it's a really subtle thing, and unless you're like forcing people to do one or the other, it's hard for them to kind of know the difference.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how did the studio then move from, okay, we've done the gallery episodes 1 and 2, you know, do we do the gallery episode 3? How did that then end up getting abandoned potentially, and then moving on to like Pistol Whip? How did that concept come about?
Abandoned?
Or was it abandoned? Or, you know, what happened there? Maybe you can tell us.
Yeah, I won't go into it all here. It would be great to talk about it in depth another time. But obviously, the way that the market, when we look at the VR market in general, it's the best way to think about it is to like transpose the PC flat screen gaming market onto the VR market and go, okay, so if your popular genres are like first person shooter, horror, action, adventure, puzzle solving, what are those percentages actually break down into? So like you might have like a really high first person shooter percentage, like it's like, you know, 70% of the market, that's what they want, and then everything else distills down. So by the time you get down to like a puzzle solving adventure game, it's like 10% of the market.
Yeah.
So in PC, you can do a really great business making adventure games if you do something quality and you get it out there. There's millions and millions and millions of adventure gamers that would love your game. We did that in VR as our first game. And so there's 10% of the active user base in VR, which is very small, very, very small. It's, you know, back then it was, you know, was it 1 million? Was it a bit more? Like it was a very, very small group. So your costs for production, because we tried to make these like pretty high production value experiences for a small team. Like we were a very, very tiny team. But anyways, the economics of it just aren't there. Like it's not that the people that want to play adventure games aren't buying the game. They all did, but it was only 10% of the market, because that's the 10% that want to buy your game. So you're talking very, very low numbers. So when moving into episode 3, and we had planned out a pretty big tranche of work for episode 3, and it also included kind of going back and revisiting episode 1 and 2 and doing kind of like a gold version of those products, and then kind of bumping them up to modern standards. So it would have kind of rounded out everything, and that's still not off the table, by the way. It's just that when looking at the market and where the market was, and to understand this, you kind of have to go back to 2018, 2019. In 2018 and 2019, the VR market in general was in serious shit.
Yeah.
Like, it was in serious trouble. I'm a fanboy through and through, but we were running on like a 6-month burn. We had 6 months, and a lot of our peers in the industry were doing worse and starting to shut down. The markers we were looking for, honestly, were, we knew that Valve was going to release their new headset. We had early access to the Index, and we knew that Oculus was going to release the Quest. And we're like, these two products are addressing most of the problems and concerns that consumers had with VR.
Yeah.
So if those two products don't actually get us over the hill in terms of adoption, then we probably have to pivot or get out of the industry. But knowing this, we're like, okay, what's going to suit something like the Quest? What, like, just in terms of, what's the graphic fidelity? It has to be something that people can understand within 30 seconds. It should be a tool to onboard new users to VR. Like, it's got to do a bunch of things right, and it's got to be simple. And because we went down the rabbit hole the entirely different way, we had climbing and deep interactions and all this shit, and we're like, well, in the end, what was it good for? I mean, sure, it inspired some people to do some things, but it didn't actually benefit our studio financially.
But isn't that challenging to go from, the gallery to something that is pistol whip? As you said, it's simpler in its way of how you approach it. So you must have been kind of like, okay, the whole think process needs to be different for this one.
Yes, it was difficult, but it was in some ways really liberating, because we knew that if we focused on a simple thing, it would get us somewhere better contextually, just in terms of, so the design challenge changed from, can we build a game that uses one button, and can we also build a game where we don't have to tell you how to move your body? Can we make it so that your lizard brain instinctively tells you how to move because you're terrified of being shot or hitting a wall or whatever? So it all kind of bubbled up from that premise, like something that we don't really have to explain. It's one button. You could throw your grandparent into it; they would get it intuitively, instantly. And so that was the design philosophy going into Pistol Whip, which actually is harder than it sounds. And the really tough thing about it was, we're like, you know what? Locomotion is such a contentious issue. Screw it. We're not even gonna mentally task the user to think about locomoting, like, at all. So how do we do that? And so we started working really hard at what is the constant forward velocity that we can safely get away with that won't make people sick. How do we focus a user's attention in the space so that they are not constantly side strafing or looking behind them? There's a lot of deep complexity in the environments themselves in terms of how much visual stimuli are in the textures and in the geo. That actually had an influence on how sick it made people. We had a small test group of like maybe 50 people come through, and we were constantly polling, like, what was your comfort level, right? We're the worst judges of that because we're in VR all the time.
Yeah.
But getting new people in, it was a really fascinating thing. So we ended up dialing in all these really weird little perceptual factors that made traveling down a constant hallway and hiding the start-stop moments and all of that, all those little tricks, feel good for like 99% of people. We've had maybe like 3 comments from thousands and thousands of players saying that they felt any discomfort. Part of it is because you're so fixated on survival that your brain actually this is a theory, but your brain actually offsets the perceptual or the cognitive load of forward motion because you're intently focused on surviving, and you're put to task, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just
Sorry,
curious.
I'm rambling.
No, we love this. We love this.
Chad is loving it as well. They're calling it a history lesson of VR. So that's it's awesome to have this on the show.
But it's funny that what you did bring back to, even that you were going for a total different game design, is room scale, because room scale is a part of Pistol Whip.
Yeah. It was like, how can we knew we couldn't we couldn't go whole hog on room scale like we did in the Starseed, but we're like, well, how do we force a user to move their body as much or more within a very confined space? So yeah, absolutely, Nathan, you're totally right. It's like, because that's also how you drive deep presence. Again, it's the more active your body is in that experience, you're so much more grounded.
And the trailer, like the mixed reality in there, it's just, you see that trailer and you immediately get what this game is about. And I think that's what a lot of like VR developers struggle with when they show a VR game, is like how it plays in virtual reality, especially for people who don't have a VR headset. But with Pistol Whip, and especially in the trailer that you guys made, once you see that, you immediately understand like how this game plays and why it is awesome.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I still remember back at OC6 when, these three guys had played the game, and they're like, Zim, you gotta track these guys down and play Pistol Whip. And at that point, you're just hearing, Pistol Whip, and I think they were talking about, the obvious comparisons in the movie side, and they're like, oh, you just got to try it. And until you try it, like it's hard to sell it, right? Because all you've got is maybe a name or a premise to go off of. It's like, you're gonna feel like John Wick, and you almost don't believe that when someone says it. You're like, yeah, okay, maybe. And then you I mean, even in that demo edition, it was like instantly like selling it. So what Rowdy's saying about the MR is, not every VR experience looks great in MR or works well, but I do think that it gives it that veneer that is like very attractive and brings it in. It sells it well, and that's the important thing.
And then in the end, the game comes out and you play it on your Oculus Go.
I did.
That's true.
That's
true.
Yeah, I saw that. It works.
Yeah. Well, I was like, I'm always like that. I always like just tinkering and testing with the various, and every so often something just clicks and it goes, hang on a second. Like right now, I've got there's a lady who in Boston who has been having this like 4-month saga with returning her touch controllers back and forth with Oculus, and they're not working. So she's like relegated to single hand Quest games, and there aren't that many that offer that option, right? And it's similar to like when you think about the difference between 6DoF and 3DoF. There are some games, not very many, Pistol Whip is one of them, where you can kind of get away a little bit with going to 3DoF, and you can still have fun. You can still complete a level. You're not going to pull any high scores or anything.
I have a funny story about, because one of the things was we recognized really early that being able to brace your hand and put a controller down made the whole thing just feel way better. But it totally confused Oculus. They're like, wait, it actually wrecked one of the systems because you couldn't have one of the controllers off camera without it causing a bunch of problems.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so they actually had to do some stuff in their API to enable us to actually just use one controller, which was fun.
So one thing we should touch on probably as well, and we will come back to Pistol Whip, is the Aperture Hand Labs experience and how you got involved in that. Because I remember when the Valve Index was coming out and teasing. I remember you guys teasing a bunch of pictures on Twitter with like little emojis covering the headsets, and it sparked a whole controversy over like, is this the new headset? Like, did you get in trouble over that? And like, how did Valve end up approaching you to say, hey, can you make this experience for us to onboard our new controllers?
Smileygate. First of all,
Smileygate.
So what I failed to recognize was how tenacious and detail oriented the like Reddit community was.
Oh yeah, nothing goes past them.
It was like
stuff zooming in.
It was like super late at night. I'm like, it's so, we've been working on this thing for so long. We were working with the writers from the original Portal, like they were there at the studio. It was a really, really cool project. I was super tired, and like I'm like, oh, it's so frustrating not being able to even tease anything. So I put up a blurred image with a smiley emoji over my head, and somebody like found a few pixels in the corner. They're like, that's an index. And it wasn't supposed to exist. So did I get in trouble? Well, I very quickly emailed Valve when that blew up, and I'm like, I'm really sorry. This wasn't my intention, obviously. And they're like, oh, it's no big deal. They were super cool about it.
Nice, that's awesome.
But actually, I'll just grab it quick. Sorry, how are we for time?
That's fine. It's fine.
This
We're
is
good.
why
We're good.
Denny hasn't disappeared yet, because they were fine with it.
But I remember we discussed that very image
Yeah, we
ourselves.
have a
in the
picture
show.
of one of your
we have it on the podcast on the show somewhere.
Yeah, we have it on the thumbnail, yeah.
I felt terrible about that. Terrible. I was horrified at myself, mainly. Anyways, so they had approached us. They were spooling up everything for the index, and because we had done so much work on the original early HTC hardware, and they were like bandwidth constrained, which sounds weird. Valve is like the biggest, smallest company on the planet. They had a lot going on. Like they were spooling up to do their own projects for the index, and there was just the whole software suite that had to be completed, just like the APIs and everything. So they're like, can you guys help us out and build something to onboard users for Knuckles? And we're like, absolutely. And then so we proposed a whole bunch of things for them, like gave them kind of like this design book, which I should ask them if I could release it, because we had a bunch of really fun ideas there.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, but it ended up coming down to the Portal universe, and we're like, can we actually use that license and that IP and build something in that universe? And they're like, yeah, sure. Again, very casual for a giant company.
It's lovely.
And so they flew Jay and the writers out to the studio, and we ended up working with them directly in building this thing. So this is the very, I don't know if you can see it, this is the earliest
Wow. Yeah.
Holy
version
moly.
of that. And I don't even know if it works anymore.
I kind of like it. It's like a micro version of the index controllers.
But no thumbsticks, of course. It was just like a touchpad back then.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
It kind of goes around your thumb, and then you had to seal it up here.
Right.
It's funny that I might have the box of that controller, because you guys once sent me a package, and then when I opened it, it said like prototype Knuckles. I was like, holy shit.
Oh, really?
And then I opened it, and there was like maple syrup in there.
Ooh, weird. Actual maple syrup, not just like spilled maple syrup.
Oh no, let's not get into that.
So yeah, we got to work with them on like how the control. This is the second version that came through, and how that evolved. They had this really deep scooped pad originally, where your thumb kind of nestled like way down into it, which was an interesting design because it kind of set your finger in there or your thumb in there in an interesting way. But there was a whole bunch of like streamlining and usability things to like. This felt very gun-like originally because there were the curves were so extreme. So it ended up kind of slowly over time kind of becoming more generic, so it could be used in different ways. I actually personally miss the thumb pad. Same goes for Oculus and those controllers.
Really?
Yeah.
As a
That's
designer,
what I said as well.
As a designer and developer, this hinders me more than it helps, because if I have a gamepad, a touch-sensitive, capacitive pad, I can do so many more things with that. Like I can turn this into so many different things, like really the sensitivity on that is far superior to a stick. I get why they all lean that way, because it's new developers coming into the ecosystem and designing for the first time. This is more approachable to them and they get it, but as a VR guy, I'm like, it feels like a step backwards.
It's a shame, because on the Valve Index controls, that little touch pad that you have is barely getting used in games, and it's also hard to use because it's a very small little touch pad.
Personally, like the trackpads can burn in hell. Like I hate them. Like I'm a thumbstick man
like I had
all day long.
I'm with my
Steam controller. I had a Steam controller, and I could almost play as well on my Steam controller using the trackpad as I could with a mouse. So I agree with Danny that like the sensitivity and precision is so much higher. You learn how to use.
Are we split 50-50 here? Because I'm definitely with Mike. Like trackpads are absolutely terrible and should burn. The sensitivity and like your motor control with that, I've never found it to be satisfactory. Like the Vive touchpads, for instance, were just very unsatisfactory to integrate with, and I found over time as well their degradation is a lot worse than an analog stick.
But
You know what happened though?
It depends on the game though, because if you played for Space Pirate Trainer, that's great with like a touchpad to scroll through the different weapons.
Yeah.
But then others are like thumbstick all the way.
But that's what Denny means. Like the amount of things that you can do with that are far wider than just with the thumbstick.
So what happened because everybody went with a stick is that game devs did everything with a stick, and like the reason I'm saying this is a move backwards is because when you are forced kind of to bare minimums, like there is one button, guess what happens in VR especially, it's like, oh, okay, this is about natural interfaces. I shouldn't be using buttons at all. I should be using my hands to gesture and grab things in the environment to do a thing. Like there shouldn't be buttons. There shouldn't. Yeah. And in fact, that overtasks like your cognitive abilities in VR. You're blind, you can't see the outside world, you're fumbling around for buttons and sticks like that. That's not VR to me. I get why their games have been developed in the way that they have to utilize that stuff, but to me it's like I would rather strip that away from developers and force them into a different like modality of thinking for VR.
And it's interesting that you know, no pun intended, stuck with your guns through the design process in Pistol Whip in exactly the same way.
Yeah, it had to be one button. Like just no bullshit.
And so it's kind of interesting, you know, you've then gone through this journey with Valve, you've worked with them with the Knuckles, you've then created the Aperture Hand Labs experience, and then, you know, like Pistol Whip is doing super well, you then release it on Quest, you've now released on PSVR as well. Can you tell us a bit about like the differences between the three platforms and, you know, each one with their challenges? Like, was one easier than the other, or did one perform well on one platform that maybe wasn't expected, or how was that working across the three platforms?
So it was interesting because while we knew we had to kind of go for a very, very low visual fidelity for Pistol Whip if it was going to perform on Quest. So we started at the baseline, okay, well, what can we do visually that's going to make sense for that won't look like absolute crap and could be translated to other platforms. So because we started there, dealing with Quest and PC VR was super simple. Like, well, I shouldn't, sorry, all the engineers are probably screaming at me right now. It was not simple, god damn it. But comparatively, like those two platforms, simple. Sony, very different story, completely different architecture, like custom engineering to get shaders and this and that working, the power of the actual console itself for VR, rendering in stereo at 90 frames a second, all that kind of stuff, really a huge challenge. So, and also because Sony is, you know, quite an old company and a giant company, there's just a lot more hoops you have to jump through to get stuff working on that platform. And then of course, so the differences in fidelity in terms of tracking, Quest is great. They like Oculus nailed inside out tracking like in a really profound way. You know, Steam VR works great, tracking, you know, similar tracking capabilities, so no problems there. Again, Sony, lots of latency, lots of things we had to kind of smooth out, and lots of engineering challenges to make that feel good on that platform. But that being said, what came out on Sony recently has gotten really great reviews and people seem to be enjoying it, so I think we nailed it.
Yeah, I think you did, because I played Pistol Whip on PSVR this week, actually testing out some haptic vests. And, you know, by the way, anyone out there, if you want to play a game with a haptic vest, like Pistol Whip is a great example of a great game to play with a haptic vest. If with a sub pack, a Woodja, you know, the bass of the music tracks along with the gun as well, like the sounds of the gun, they just work perfectly for a haptic vest experience. So, you know, you should definitely go try that out. And it's interesting, you know, that you've managed to, like you say, iron out all that stuff, because for me, it didn't feel any different from playing it on PC or Quest. So I think you've done a great job there.
That's good.
I had a question as well, like, you know, what do you see for the future for Cloudhead? Is there anything that you can share with us?
I was talking to you guys earlier about whether or not I should even say anything. There's lots of stuff in the pipe. So there's some really fun, cool stuff being announced soon for Pistol Whip. Did I say that earlier today, or was that private?
Yeah, you did.
That was earlier today, yeah.
Okay. So beyond that, Cloudhead does have a labs. It's only like 4 of us that are in the labs. And we are working on something really exciting for how we do this stuff, how we communicate, but it's done in a very game developer way. And I would love to share more about that, and I definitely will soon-ish. But I'm personally excited about it because it's, in some ways, it's like a mini metaverse is what I keep calling it. That's all I can say.
Okay, so Cloudhead Games is working on a mini metaverse.
A mini metaverse, like working collaboration tool, like so you can socialize and remote work. Is that the kind of plan of it?
It can be used in a whole bunch of different ways. It could be used for just casual hanging out with friends, but it could also be used for conventions and school and work. But it's all about organic collaboration tools that are they're kind of gamified. Like it's a different kind of modality than you would get from like a corporation or a business trying to make a communication.
And it's called Cloudhead Horizon. No.
So maybe we should wrap up the conversation. Maybe we should take a couple of questions from the chat, and I'll ask a couple more questions myself. But maybe one of the questions I think is an important one is, especially with everything going on with the community being angered about, the Facebook account being required on new Oculus headsets moving forward. What are your thoughts on that, and also like the community reaction about that?
Like I said, it's a weird time for VR developers specifically, and my heart goes out to every studio trying to navigate their way through all of this, because there's only a few companies that actually have the capacity and the hardware power to make VR a real thing. And so it's a constant like internal struggle with modern politics and who's in trouble for this and that. But in the meantime, we're just like, pretty earnest VR developers trying to make VR a real thing for the majority of the planet. And so my thoughts on that are just that people have to remember the people really driving VR, the developers, the enthusiasts, and the hardware makers they're all in it for the same reasons, which is to bring like this magical new medium to the masses, to the entire planet.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with politics at that level. It's just people who want the technology to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and it leads me on to my next question: is what do you think the most important thing in VR is right now, or what do you think it will be moving forward?
Accessibility. I think we've reached a really interesting tipping point with the way hardware is moving. So it'll really come down now, I think, to price and accessibility. Getting people in headsets has always been VR's biggest problem, and we're finally starting to cross a threshold where that is happening. And I think the doors are about to open up for developers in a pretty big way. And I think the next year will kind of reveal that more. But once that happens, like once we get past this just very basic entry point where everybody can afford the hardware and most people are getting into the hardware and finding utility in the hardware, like there's good software in all ways. Once that happens, then all the stuff that you guys and I care about will start happening, which is like deeper haptics, finger haptics, expanded field of view, smaller, lighter, better, faster, all of that stuff, right? So it's all gonna have like a natural avalanche effect, I think. And I don't think that's far away. I honestly believe like COVID, as horrible as it's been, has been astounding for VR, because it's shown people what the true potential of VR is mentally, like in terms of escapism, in terms of like giving yourself a mental reset when you can't go anywhere, or in terms of fitness and a whole bunch of different factors. So I think that is just going to continue to build, quite honestly.
Yeah. Awesome.
Nice.
Awesome. Any questions
Very
from the chat that you want to bring in?
I had a few noted down. We had actually some questions about the gallery episode 3. When is it coming out?
I don't know.
And then we had Paradise Decay asking, does Denny think VR is in a good place now for developers? And how much of his response is a result of how successful Pistol Whip has been? Would he still feel the same way if Pistol Whip didn't do well?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's come up on Twitter quite a bit, like that whole discussion with different developers about what's actually working. So I can say without question, Quest is outperforming every other platform, like by a huge margin. So we owe our success in a lot of ways to Quest as a platform. And it's a bunch of factors. It's accessibility and ease of use and price point and not needing a PC, and like they just removed so many friction points for consumers that platform is performing very well, very strongly. So you can't ignore that platform. Sorry,
is there still a place for PC VR for developers?
It should always, but it should always be like in the current market. If you're not considering Quest at the top of your development cadence and like where it sits, then you're missing the biggest market. And so if you have political viewpoints that make you averse to going on Facebook or Quest, I respect that, but you're probably not going to survive this market. Yeah. The numbers on PC are just too low. Like unless you're doing everything exactly right, you're not going to perform where you need to perform. Pistol Whip, it did a lot of things right, so it's doing pretty well on PC. It's doing much better on Quest, and then it's like Quest, PC, and then PSVR. That's kind of like the slope.
So as a developer, like right now you have two options, or you try to get your game approved for the Oculus store, and if that doesn't work, then SideQuest is still a great place to go to. But besides that, there's nothing really else standalone wise.
Yeah, it's
right.
It's still a very challenging market, and you still have to, like, a big part of running a VR studio is making the right relationships, which is also what makes COVID so difficult for studios. And so, like, my advice to any studio is go through that process though of making the relationships. Reach out to your peers if you don't have any. A demo is always the best thing. You're never going to convince anybody of anything unless you have a demo, and that's a really hard sell for a lot of studios because you have to put money and time into building a demo, but you have to do that exercise or no one's going to listen or take the time to look at your product. And so even if it's just a vertical slice, like do a burn for 3 months, show them that proof of concept, give them a 2-page document that explains what it is. That's where you're going to get the most buy-in, and that's more likely how you will get on Oculus and that storefront right now. But that doesn't stop you from launching on Steam or PC. Like, so get your thing out in early access. That's still a good way to go, and build from there. So, but get a demo. You need a demo, or you're not going to go anywhere.
Very solid. Good. I had another question here. I saw some in the chat being written down as well. Let me see real quick where it is.
Someone quickly asked, do you think there'll ever be the gallery on Quest?
Oculus asked us that question, actually. It's not out of the question. It depends on how the technology evolves. And like you guys have seen some of the stuff they've released, maybe it was last year, about like AI assisted rendering and kind of like using the cloud to fill in the blanks. And so suddenly you can have like these super high fidelity PC experiences on a mobile device on Quest. That stuff's really interesting. And that's also something PC developers should be looking out for. Just in terms of going, well, my game will never make it to that platform. Don't say never. Like that's a possibility in like the next few years.
That's interesting.
And then we have one final question, maybe from Stubborn Ninja. Have you guys ever felt like you're competing directly with Beat Saber?
No, Beat Saber is such a gigantic machine. I don't think they hit everything right at the right moment and on every platform. And to do that it's like striking gold or winning the lottery. I think we're a very different game. Like when you actually play the two experiences, I think they're very, very different. We're definitely in the same family of like rhythm-based games, and we're doing really well. I have no complaints about how we're performing. And I feel for developers who are trying to find that right mix of stuff that will hit people the right way. Again, my advice is like go through all the top-selling charts on every storefront. Look at what's actually performing and try to understand why. Understand what mechanics are actually getting people to pick up their headsets and go back into an experience. Like the retention is a super important part of what you have to break down to understand why people are excited about anything.
Great answer. Yeah, that is really, really great. Thank you so much, Denny. Like having you on the show, it's been awesome. A lot of people in the chat have really enjoyed it as well, made comments about, you know, it's like a history lesson in VR, and I think it's true. You know, have you being there from the beginning, you know, you really have this like unique insight into the industry, and documenting it, you know, on a show like this is going to be really important, I think, for the future, that one day someone can maybe look back and say, oh, this is how it all started. That's really awesome. And I think, you know, we should really give you the credit that you deserve in terms of a lot of the mechanics that you kind of like pioneered back in the day in terms of locomotion, inventory, and stuff like that. So yeah, congrats to you and the team, and we're just, you know, really, really happy that you've really struck success with Pistol Whip, and you definitely all deserve it. And I can't wait to see what this new announcement is in the next coming weeks, and what you do in the future as well.
I hope to see you soon on an event.
Yeah, that too, absolutely. Yeah,
Thank you.
We miss being in paper planes and drinking with you guys.
Thank you so much for all of that. It means a lot, and it's not just me. There's a whole company of people who have worked their asses off for 7 years doing all that stuff, and yeah, I have nothing else to say, I don't think, other than thanks.
We really appreciate it.
I got really gray over the years too.
Yeah, I'll be that way soon enough.